Welcome to our new podcast, Two Old Sexperts, talking sexuality and disabilities, with Shawn McGill and Sharon Potter. Landing out of uh, undergraduate school, I walked into a job because I needed a job supporting people with disabilities. Nearly 26 years later, I'm still supporting people with disabilities. And the idea for this podcast has been sort of swirling in my head for quite a while. And I met with dear old Sharon Potter, one of the original mentors and dear friends, over dinner this past summer and discussed the idea. And here it came to fruition. And for me, it's vitally important to try to capture as much information and get it out there to people because not many people are still talking about sexuality when it comes to people with disabilities. So, Sharon, I want to tap into you as much as possible because I think you're a wealth of information, as was David Hinsberger, who we lost this
Yes.
past year, and Jim Hovan was another huge influencer in my life. So, I want you to just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why this is important to you, also.
Okay, thank you. I'm very excited about this. I'm Sharon Potter, and I have an undergraduate in psychology and a master's in human sexuality with a focus on people with disabilities. I was with the federal agency that advocates for people in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Protection and Advocacy. I was on a few committees, and on one of them was the chief psychologist for the Department of Corrections. And he asked what we as an agency were doing to support people coming out of prison that had disabilities and were sex offenders. So a small group of us got together and tried to find some programs that we thought could help us getting started. And we did. We found one in Vermont and we spent time there and we wrote a grant and we did a program called Safer Options. And it was for people with intellectual disabilities who also had problematic sexual behavior or sex offenders. That went extremely well. And that was quite a few years ago. And we did used to train the trainer model, and it's still being used. It's called Safer Options. But as we step away from that, it's very clear to me that we probably wouldn't have problems with sex offenders or problematic sexual behavior if we did more upfront sexuality education. And I'm delighted to be working with Shawn. We've had some of the same issues, and sometimes they seem so simple, but they get very complicated in when they get into the system with people who are afraid of what to do. They're uncomfortable around sexuality. They have their own baggage maybe, and so we're very excited about being able to reach out to people and provide whatever information we can and to give examples of things that went wrong and how we maybe help them to turn around and get a little bit better.
It's interesting to me, Sharon, that our work in sexuality, specifically with people with who have disabilities, really stemmed from working with people who were deemed sex offenders or who have problematic sexual behaviors. So it really sort of confirms everything we've been speculating over the years, that unless we're teaching about safe, consenting sex education, people still are not getting this in special education all the time. We're going to continue to have problems. And that's not just with offending, but that's also with the abuse prevention and safety end of things, which I know is also very sort of near and dear to your heart as well.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I sort of surprised me until I realized that it is unfortunately all too common that people with autism and who maybe have a mild disability often get arrested for stalking. And the same thing with child pornography. Many people with autism, because of the social skills disability difficulty in those areas, will go online and they may go to an adult site, and they're legal, but it's easy to slip into the kid stuff. And when I had two men that I worked with who had been arrested for child pornography, and they did not get the connection. They both said I would never hurt a child, and I never ever would hurt a child. I was just looking at a picture. And I explained to them that every time a new video is made, a child gets harmed. And that's how it happens. The more people that watch, the more children get hurt. And they were both incredibly upset and just had absolutely no idea about the process. And that's the kind of thing that we don't take time to explain. And so people just don't understand. They don't have the information.
Right. And I think it's so important for us to impress upon the fact that, we're not just going to be talking about sexuality and the act of sex. You've alluded to the fact it's very complicated, and there are sort of all these other caveats that we need to be addressing, like social skills,
Yeah.
understanding body language, and the complexities to relationships, what you say and what you do based on, the social relationship that you have with people. These are all components of learning about relationships and sexuality.
Exactly. There are so many things, and some of them are simple. And I mean, one of the things that we've talked about is sometimes if there are two people in a group home, for instance, who are um, caught, and that word just catches in my throat because it's a negative one for me. But a staff person finds two people together kissing or touching each other. A report has to be made about that. Of course it does. But and sometimes what happens after the report is filed, that one person is sort of seen as an offender and the other is seen as a victim, when maybe they're just trying to figure it out.
Mhm.
And but the process of figuring it out takes support from staff and conversations that may be uncomfortable, but it's just really important to respect people and help them through and out into a world where they can function safely and with a partner if they so choose. So it's good to be able to provide that information. When we talk about actually like sex education for people, um, we're not. It shouldn't be what we give to people in seventh grade. I mean, often what we hear from families, often who want to protect their family members, don't they won't understand it. Don't give them the information, or don't give it to them because then they might want to do something. Well, they're adults. Their bodies are adult bodies, and they will have sexual feelings, and that's a reality. So we need to help people to understand what they're feeling and how to manage those feelings. I mean, when we talk about meeting with people, adults with disabilities, and talking about sex education, we're just not talking about body parts and plumbing. We're talking about body parts and what exactly are their functions, and what are the words that are used to identify those bodies and functions. What are the slang words? I mean, there are slang words I am not comfortable with, but I'm certainly not going to shame someone that uses it. I will say that's one word, and the other word is, and I'll give the correct word. And often I'll add, if you ever have to see a doctor or tell your staff that you have a problem, this is the word you should use. And I mean, I just think that's important, that people have a good understanding of their bodies. And peer pressure that people have all the time. They want to have friends and do things, and just like we all do. And sometimes there's someone that will take advantage of that. I'll be your friend if. And so we need to be able to help people to become more assertive and be sure who they are and what they want to do. Do they really want to be doing that, or not? And the whole LGBTQ issues, which I know we're going to get into. I mean, 10%, one in 10. I mean, no matter where you are, and within the community that we support as well. So we have to be supportive and encouraging around those issues.
And these are all things that people need to get comfortable with. So, even if you
Yes,
get uncomfortable, if you're working in this field, you have to be able to drop the baggage at the door and get on board, because this is where morals, beliefs, values get in the way. And one of the things that rubs me the wrong way is hearing people use the term inappropriate when talking about sexuality. Because for me,
yes,
what does inappropriate mean? I mean, I probably do lots of things that are considered inappropriate, but I wouldn't share that with you. And I
yeah,
certainly wouldn't have a team meeting of 20 people talking about it. But we need to teach the
exactly.
context of what's legal and what's illegal, not what's appropriate.
I know when I hear the word appropriate, within the context of what we're talking about, it means bad or shame on you or you're wrong. And it's inappropriate to use inappropriate.
And hearing you talk, the David Hinsberger just kept popping up in my head. I remember sitting in Butler. He was here with Joe and doing a training on abuse prevention and safety, and going back to correct terminology to describe body parts. Even if you're non-speaking, we can teach people to identify body parts using the correct terminology. And again, looking at the abuse prevention and safety end of things, that's so vital, because I have been on the end of investigations where people said, well, he or she can't say it, or they're, can't identify. So
Exactly.
we're just going to let this go. And we need to stop letting things go.
Yeah, depending on how you ask the question, um, you can get an answer. You can, and
Absolutely.
we have to step out of our comfort zones because when just think about the world we live in, and we use sex to sell everything, cars and books and everything. But when it comes right down to discussing it in a real way that would be helpful, people are uncomfortable. And I think it's important to help staff. And there are lots of activities that we can do for staff to help them kind of move out of their comfort zone. What messages did they get as children? Well, some of them are ridiculous and funny. And so you can have some lightness around the discussion. But then you look at them and say, how do you feel about that message that you got when you were 14? Do you still feel the same way? And of course, most people don't. And how did you learn? Was it the talk with your parents or a book or your friends, or was it through victimization? Which is very high rate with the folks that we're helping here, trying to help and work with. We just have to be. One of the things I always like to do after I've given someone some information or after a chat is ask them to tell me then what we just talked about, and then I'm fairly sure that they understand what we just discussed.
That's interesting. I tell them, you're the professor and you're teaching me. So give me the lesson on what you just learned.
Boy, that's the truth. I've learned far more than I've taught. That's for certain. I just think about the resources that we have too. We have all David's wonderful material, his books, and we have other things, exercises. I have a cute little book that I use. It's called the Cookie Sutra. I think it's delightful because if someone has a history of abuse, you don't want to re-traumatize them with real life things. It has to be real. Everybody knows what we're talking about. But the Cookie Sutra is actually cookies in different sexual positions, and it's delightful. For people who have had a stroke or have some kind of physical limitations, it's humorous, but it's helpful. It's very helpful. And there's a recipe for cookies at the end of the book. So
Clearly you have the most information because you've been doing this for so long, and I've tried to just follow the people and learn from people who were doing this work. But I'm getting nervous because I feel like the information is going to die off if we're not really doing something to carry it on. Because I'm not seeing other professionals in the field coming up and just really being sort of not just pioneers, but serious advocates specializing in this work. And I think it's needed for sure.
yes, yeah, I agree. When we did the safer options that was, specific to problematic sexual behavior, we used a train the trainer model, and there were people using, and there still are people using the handbook that we developed. But there's nothing like that happening around general sexuality. And I think it's so important. People can have real, wonderful, full lives if they have good, full information. And it just seems a shame to me that we don't do that or don't do enough of it.
If folks are required to do fire drills and that's a requirement, then why aren't we teaching things like sexuality and abuse prevention and safety? And I do think it's still sort of a double-edged sword, or sort of a conflict of interest, if we're allowing providers to investigate their own individuals that they're supporting too. So, we have a long way to go, but I'm hopeful that in talking more about this and amplifying some of this information, we'll see some good change along the way also.
I hope so too. And I'm very excited about the interest that is being shown. I think that's very exciting.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Two Sexperts talking disabilities and sexuality. Be sure to join us during our next episode.